January 17th, 1944. Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. The jungle breathed with moisture. Every leaf dripped, every root twisted through black volcanic soil that had known no plow, no road, no boundary line drawn by men who believed in nations. The air hung thick, so thick that breath itself felt like swallowing cloth. In the pre-dawn darkness, beneath a canopy so dense that even moonlight died before reaching the ground, the earth trembled. Not from artillery, not yet. From something older. The island itself, restless, groaning beneath the weight of war. Captain Hiroshi Yamada stood at the entrance to what his engineers had promised was impregnable. A cave system. Not just one hollow in the hillside, but a labyrinth. Tunnels that snaked through limestone and volcanic rock for nearly 2 kilometers, connecting 17 separate chambers, some large enough to hold 100 men standing shoulder to shoulder. His boots were caked with mud the color of rust. His uniform, once pressed to rigid standards in Tokyo, now hung loose on a frame that had lost 14 kilograms since Guadalcanal. He did not think about food. He thought about defense, about holding, about the Emperor's words, committed to memory during officer training. To die for the Emperor is to live forever. The cave entrances, 3 primary, 11 secondary, had been fortified according to doctrine. Logs stripped from ironwood trees, stacked and braced. Firing ports carved at angles that allowed overlapping fields of fire. Ammunition stored in the deepest chambers where dampness could be controlled with canvas and prayer. Rice in sealed drums, and water collected from an underground spring that tasted of minerals and time. They had prepared for siege, for bombardment, for the Americans to come crashing against these hillsides like waves against a seawall, breaking, retreating, breaking again until their will collapsed under the weight of their own dead. What Captain Yamada had not prepared for, what no manual, no training exercise, no tactical briefing in all his years of service had suggested, was silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of patience. The Americans had arrived 3 days prior, not in the expected human wave, not with the reckless frontal assaults that Japanese intelligence briefings had promised characterized American tactical thinking. They had simply stopped. 70 meters from the nearest cave entrance, they had stopped, dug in, and watched. Yet through field glasses, Yamada had observed them. Engineers, mostly. Men who moved with the deliberate efficiency of workers, not warriors. They carried tools he recognized, shovels, axes, coils of rope, and tools he did not. Strange mechanical pumps, rubber hoses thick as a man's thigh, metal drums stenciled with English words he could not read. The Americans were building something. That much was clear, but what they were building made no sense. 3 months earlier, in November 1943, the United States Army had learned a lesson written in blood across the caves of Tarawa. The lesson was simple, brutal, and expensive. Frontal assault against fortified cave positions produced casualty rates that no democracy could sustain. On Tarawa, Marines had died by the hundreds trying to root out Japanese defenders from coral bunkers and cave systems. Flamethrowers ran out of fuel. Grenades bounced off stone. Men crawled into darkness and did not crawl out. The mathematics were merciless. Every cave cost lives. Every tunnel was a tomb that consumed attackers faster than commanders could feed men into the grinding machinery of close combat. So the Americans did what they always did when confronted with a problem that cost too many lives. They engineered a solution. The solution had a designation: Chemical Warfare Service, Portable Flame Unit, M2-2. But the men who operated it called it something else. They called it the Dragon. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a system, a philosophy made mechanical. Instead of sending men into caves with rifles and grenades, the Americans would send fire, not just fire, liquid fire, napalm, a substance that clung to stone and flesh alike, that burned hot enough to consume oxygen, that turned enclosed spaces into ovens. But even napalm had limitations. It required men to approach cave entrances, required exposure to defensive fire, required courage that, while abundant, was not infinite. What the engineers had discovered on Bougainville was something simpler, something older than napalm, older than gunpowder. They had discovered smoke, not the smoke of battle, gray and dispersing, but smoke as weapon, smoke as siege engine. The engineers had studied the cave systems, had mapped them with the obsessive precision that characterized American military planning, had noted the airflow, the ventilation shafts, the way wind moved through limestone like breath through lungs. And they had realized something that Captain Yamada, despite his training, despite his dedication, had not considered. A cave is only defensible if the defenders can breathe. January 18th, 1944, 0600 hours. The smoke generators started at dawn, not with drama, but with the mundane cough of diesel engines. 12 units positioned at measured intervals around the cave complex. Each generator was a simple thing, a barrel, a fuel source, an ignition system. But simplicity, applied with American abundance, became overwhelming. The generators burned a mixture of fuel oil and sulfur compounds, producing clouds of white-gray smoke so dense it seemed solid. Smoke that did not rise and disperse, but sank, poured, flowed like water seeking the lowest point. The engineers had sealed all but 3 cave entrances, not with explosives. Explosives could be cleared. They sealed them with concrete. Tons of it is mixed on-site using portable mixers that ran on gasoline engines. The concrete was poured into wooden frames that had been built flush against the cave mouths, creating walls 2 feet thick. While the concrete set, the smoke generators ran continuously. The remaining 3 entrances, the ones left deliberately open, became chimneys. The smoke poured in, seeking every tunnel, every chamber, every crack in the volcanic stone. Inside, Captain Yamada ordered the men to retreat deeper, to the prepared positions in the rear chambers where the air was supposed to be clearest, where water and rice were stored, where they could wait out whatever the Americans were attempting. The first hour was uncomfortable but manageable. Men coughed, eyes watered, but discipline held. They wet cloths and tied them over mouths and noses, while they rationed water carefully. They waited. The second hour, the smoke thickened. It was not dissipating, not being pulled away by natural ventilation as it should have been. Instead, it was accumulating, building. The cave system that had promised protection was now a trap, a stone bottle being filled with poison air. Men began to panic, not openly, not in ways that would shame them before their brothers, but in the small ways that discipline could not fully contain. Breathing too fast, drinking too much water, asking questions that officers could not answer. By the third hour, men were passing out, not from the smoke directly, but from lack of oxygen. The smoke was consuming it. Each breath contained less and less of what lungs required and more of what they could not process. Some men tried to reach the entrances, to escape into air that could be breathed, but found them sealed, not barricaded, sealed, solid. The concrete had set. The wood bracing had been removed from the outside. There was no gap to dig through, no weakness to exploit. Captain Yamada understood then, with the clarity that comes only in extremis, what the Americans had done. They had not prepared an assault. They had prepared a burial. They were not going to fight for these caves. They were going to erase them, to seal them as one might seal a tomb, leaving the defenders not dead by bullet or blade, but simply gone, removed from the equation of battle as efficiently as an accountant removes a line item from a ledger. The philosophy was American in ways that Japanese military doctrine had failed to anticipate. where Japanese training emphasized spirit over material. Courage over calculation, the Americans had built an entire war machine on the opposite premise: that lives were precious, that efficiency was moral, that the proper application of resources could substitute for the sacrifice of men. They did not believe that death in battle was glorious. They believed it was wasteful. Every American soldier who died was a son who would not return to a farm in Iowa, a brother who would not rebuild a factory in Detroit, a father who would not raise children in the California sun. American democracy had given its military a mandate that Japanese imperialism never could: win, but bring our sons home. So the Americans engineered. They calculated. They applied industrial methods to the problem of fortified positions. Smoke generators could run for days on diesel fuel. A concrete could be mixed faster than men could dig through it. The mathematics were inexorable. For the cost of fuel and cement, resources America possessed in quantities that seemed, to Japanese observers, almost mythological, an entire battalion could be neutralized without firing a shot. The horror Captain Yamada felt was not the simple horror of dying. He had made peace with death long before Bougainville. It was the horror of irrelevance, of being defeated not by superior courage or greater sacrifice, but by superior logistics, by engineers who treated war as a problem of materials and methods, who looked at a defended cave system and saw not a military challenge but an engineering task. Seal inputs, eliminate outputs, wait for chemistry to do its work. January 19, 1944, 1,400 hours. The smoke generators ran for 36 hours, continuously, without pause. The engineers rotated in shifts, maintaining the machines with the same care a farmer might show his tractor during harvest. They monitored fuel levels, adjusted mixture ratios, made notes in waterproof field books about optimal generator placement and smoke density. This was not battle. This was research. The caves of Bougainville were a laboratory, and the Japanese defenders were test subjects in an experiment about the industrial application of suffocation. When the generators finally shut down, the silence was profound. The smoke, having no more fuel to sustain it, began to dissipate slowly, pulled away by the same natural ventilation that had once seemed a feature of good defensive design. The engineers waited another 12 hours. Then, wearing gas masks as a precaution, they approached the unsealed entrances with the caution of men who had learned not to underestimate enemy resolve. They found Captain Yamada 20 meters inside the main entrance. He had died trying to dig through concrete with his bare hands. His fingers were broken, his nails torn away. Around him, 73 men lay in positions that suggested they had died hours apart, some near the entrance, some deeper in the tunnels, arranged in the order of their desperation and the strength of their lungs. A few had committed suicide rather than suffocate, their service pistols still in their hands. Most had simply fallen where they stood when the oxygen ran out. The Americans cataloged everything: weapons, ammunition, supplies. It was standard procedure. But what struck the engineers, what appeared in their reports and later in their letters home, was the food. The caves had been stocked with rice enough for 3 months, water for 6 weeks, medical supplies carefully organized, maps marked with defensive positions that would never be manned. It was all there, all prepared, all useless. The Japanese had planned for every contingency except the one the Americans had chosen: to simply delete the problem rather than solve it through combat. Across the Pacific Theater, as 1944 turned toward 1945, the tactic spread. Not officially at first, military bureaucracy moved slower than field innovation. But engineers talked to engineers. Lessons learned on Bougainville appeared in after-action reports on Palayu. Smoke generator requisitions increased. Some concrete mixing equipment became standard issue for marine engineering battalions. By the time American forces reached Iwo Jima, The doctrine had been formalized. Bypass when possible, seal when necessary, assault only as a last resort. The Japanese High Command struggled to develop countermeasures. Ventilation systems were redesigned, but that required resources and time that island garrisons did not possess. Orders were issued to dig multiple escape tunnels, but the Americans had learned to identify these through systematic mapping and aerial reconnaissance. Some Japanese commanders ordered their men to abandon cave defenses entirely, but that surrendered the only advantage the Japanese possessed: fortification. In the open, American firepower was overwhelming. In the caves, at least there had been a chance. Oh, but now, even that chance was being engineered away. For the Japanese soldiers who had been taught that defensive positions were sacred ground to be held to the last man, the American method was philosophically incomprehensible. How does one fight an enemy who refuses to fight? Who treats defended positions not as challenges to be overcome, but as problems to be eliminated? The samurai spirit that had sustained Japanese military culture for centuries had no answer for industrial efficiency applied with democratic purpose. The object that haunted Japanese nightmares was not a weapon. It was a barrel. A simple diesel smoke generator, painted olive drab, stenciled with English letters and numbers that meant nothing to men who had learned war through the lens of Bushido. Yet the barrel represented something that Japanese military philosophy had no framework to process: the idea that American lives were more valuable than American materiel. That democracy measured victory not in blood sacrificed, but in blood preserved. That industrial capacity, properly applied, could substitute for courage. Every Japanese officer who studied the American advance across the Pacific noted the same phenomenon. The Americans spent resources with a profligacy that seemed insane. They fired 10 artillery shells where Japanese doctrine would fire 1. They brought 3 tanks to destroy a single machine gun nest. They dropped thousands of tons of bombs on islands that could have been bypassed. To Japanese observers trained in the efficiency of scarcity, it looked like waste, like decadence. What they failed to understand was that America could afford waste, could afford inefficiency. The industrial base that had built skyscrapers and automobiles and transcontinental railroads had been turned toward war with the same lavish application of resources. For every smoke generator running on Bougainville, there were 10 more on ships heading to the next island. For every ton of concrete poured to seal a cave, there were 100 more tons being mixed at supply depots. America had made a choice, perhaps the defining choice of democratic warfare, that machines were expendable and men were not. April 12, 1945. Okinawa. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka stood at the entrance to a cave complex on Kakazu Ridge. He was 23 years old. He had read the reports from Bougainville, from Peleliu, from Iwo Jima. He knew what was coming. Yet the Americans were 300 meters away, their engineers already unloading equipment from trucks. He could see the barrels, the concrete mixers, the methodical, unhurried preparation of men who were not preparing for battle but for industrial process. He had given his men a choice, though choice was not something Japanese military doctrine acknowledged. They could stay in the caves and wait for the smoke, or they could exit and face American machine guns. It was a choice between suffocation and bullets, between dying slowly in darkness or quickly in sunlight. 37 men chose to stay. 16, including Tanaka, chose to walk out. The Americans did not shoot them, not immediately. They ordered them to the ground, searched them, bound their hands with cord, loaded them into trucks, gave them water from canteens that had ice in them. Ice in the middle of a battlefield, as if the Americans had so much of everything that even prisoners received luxuries. Tanaka drank. He did not want to, but thirst was not a thing that could be commanded away by discipline, and the water was cold and clean and abundant. He watched the engineers work, watched the smoke generators start, watched the concrete being poured. And he understood, finally, what his instructors in Tokyo had not taught him: that America was not fighting for glory or empire or racial destiny. America was fighting to go home. Every sealed cave was one less battle. Every suffocated garrison was 100 American mothers who would see their sons again. The efficiency was not cruelty. It was mercy. American mercy, calculated in lives saved and resources spent. It measured against a balance sheet where democracy insisted that its sons were priceless. The caves of the Pacific became tombs, not because the Japanese were cowards, but because they had prepared to fight an enemy that no longer existed. They had trained for a war of spirit against spirit, of courage against courage. But the Americans had brought a different war entirely, a war of resources against positions, of engineering against fortification, of industrial democracy against military imperialism. And in that war, the outcome was never in doubt. Not because American soldiers were braver. Courage existed in abundance on both sides, but because America could afford to spend steel instead of blood, fuel instead of lives, concrete instead of courage. The smoke that poured into those caves was not just chemical compounds and diesel exhaust, yet it was philosophy made visible. It was the physical manifestation of a society that had decided, through the mechanisms of democracy, that life, even the life of an ordinary farm boy from Nebraska, was too valuable to spend unnecessarily, that if machines could die instead of men, then machines would die, that if fuel and concrete could substitute for human sacrifice, then fuel and concrete would be used without limit. For the Japanese soldiers who had been raised to believe that death in service to the emperor was the highest possible achievement, this was not merely defeat, it was erasure. To die in battle was glorious. To be sealed in a cave and forgotten was not death, it was deletion. It was being removed from the narrative of war as efficiently as an editor removes unnecessary words from a text. The Americans were not defeating them. They were making them irrelevant. August 10, 1945. Tokyo. The surrender was 6 days away, though most Japanese did not yet know it. In the offices of the Imperial Army General Staff, officers reviewed reports from across the Pacific. Island after island lost, not through lack of courage. The reports were unanimous on that point. Japanese soldiers had fought with exactly the dedication and spirit that doctrine required. They had held positions to the last man, had charged into machine gun fire, had died by the thousands in banzai attacks that doctrine promised would break enemy morale. But the Americans had not broken. Their morale had not collapsed. They had simply continued to advance, slowly, methodically, spending resources instead of lives wherever possible. And when resources could not substitute for combat, so they had fought with a material superiority that made courage irrelevant. One American division had more artillery than an entire Japanese army. One American supply ship carried more food than was available to an entire Japanese island garrison for a month. The officers read the reports about the caves, about the smoke generators and the concrete, about entire battalions neutralized without the Americans suffering a single casualty. And they understood, though few would say it aloud, that they had been defeated not by better soldiers, but by a better system, by a society that valued life over glory, that measured victory in sons returned rather than enemies killed, that applied industrial logic to the ancient problem of war. The emperor's voice would soon crackle over radio speakers across Japan, yet to speaking words that had never been spoken by any emperor, that the war was lost, that surrender was necessary, that the unendurable must be endured. But for the officers who had read the reports from Bougainville and Peleliu and Okinawa, surrender was not a shock. It was inevitable. They had been fighting with weapons forged from spirit and sacrifice. The Americans had fought with weapons forged from steel mills and assembly lines, backed by a democracy that insisted its people were too valuable to waste. In the decades after the war, historians would debate the morality of many things: the firebombing of cities, the atomic bombs, the internment of civilians. But the caves received little attention. They were a footnote, a tactical innovation. The numbers were small compared to the grand battles, a few hundred men here, a few dozen there. But for the men who had suffocated in darkness, for the engineers who had sealed them in, for the Japanese officers who had read the reports and understood what they meant, the caves were not a footnote. They were a revelation, a demonstration of what happens when industrial democracy applies itself fully to the problem of war. The Americans had looked at defended positions and seen not military objectives, but engineering challenges. They had calculated the cost in lives versus the cost in materiel, and had chosen materiel every time. They had poured concrete and pumped smoke and waited with the patience of men who knew that time and resources were on their side. The smoke that killed Captain Yamada and Lieutenant Tanaka and thousands of other men whose names appear only in Japanese casualty lists was not poison gas in the legal sense. And it was not outlawed by any treaty. It was simply industrial exhaust applied with purpose. But it killed just as surely as bullets or bombs. More slowly, perhaps. More terribly in the experience of those who breathed it, but also more efficiently in the calculus that measured American lives saved against resources expended. The symbol that emerged from those caves was not a weapon or a flag. It was concrete. Gray, utilitarian, mixed from Portland cement and aggregate and water, poured into forms and allowed to set until it became harder than stone. Concrete was American in every way that mattered: industrial, abundant, functional. It was not beautiful. It made no appeal to aesthetics or tradition. It simply worked. In the years after the war, that concrete would build highways across America, dams on the Tennessee River, or runways for commercial aircraft. The same engineers who had sealed caves on Bougainville would return home and build bridges, airports, shopping centers. They would apply the same methodical efficiency to peace that they had applied to war. And if they sometimes woke in the night thinking about caves full of men who had died waiting for air, they did not speak of it. That was not the American way. The American way was to build, to produce, to overwhelm problems with resources and engineering until the problems disappeared. The caves of the Pacific had been a problem. The smoke generators and concrete had been the solution. The fact that the solution involved suffocation rather than combat did not change the mathematics. American engineers had been given a task: neutralize enemy positions while minimizing friendly casualties. Yes, they had succeeded. The morality of that success was a question for others to answer. For Japan, the lesson was bitter but complete. The war had been lost not on the battlefield. Courage had been abundant on all sides, but in the factories and foundries, in the steel mills and shipyards, in the oil refineries and assembly lines. The Americans had not been better soldiers. They had been better producers. They had spent metal instead of men, fuel instead of blood, concrete instead of courage. And in doing so, they had proven that in modern war, the society that can afford waste will defeat the society that cannot. The caves taught a lesson that would echo through the rest of the century, shaping how wars were fought and how they were avoided. The lesson was simple. In a conflict between industrial democracy and military imperialism, and between a society that values individual life and a society that glorifies collective sacrifice, the society with more resources and a willingness to spend them will prevail. Not through greater courage, not through superior spirit, but through the patient application of overwhelming material advantage. The smoke that poured into those caves was the ghost of American abundance, made visible and deadly. It represented a nation that could afford to burn fuel for days to avoid spending lives for hours. A democracy that had calculated the value of its citizens and found them more precious than any amount of steel or concrete or diesel oil. For the Japanese soldiers who died breathing that smoke, understanding came too late. The Americans had not come to fight for these caves. They had come to delete them, and American industry, once committed to a task, did not leave problems unsolved. In the end, it was not the smoke that killed them. It was the realization, in those final suffocating moments, that they had been defeated not by a better army, but by a better system, by a society that had turned its factories and farms and foundries toward a single purpose: to win the war and bring its sons home. Whatever spirit the emperor had promised would carry them to victory, it could not compete with concrete mixers and smoke generators and an enemy that counted the lives of its own soldiers as the only currency that mattered. The exits were sealed. The smoke poured in. And in the darkness of those caves, surrounded by rice they would never eat and ammunition they would never fire, the Japanese soldiers learned the final lesson of the Pacific War: that courage without resources is tragedy, and that in modern war, abundance is the only strategy that cannot be defeated. The smoke cleared. The concrete set. The engineers moved on to the next island, and behind them, sealed in volcanic stone, lay the physical proof of what democracy at war could accomplish, not through glory, but through the patient, methodical application of American industrial power to the problem of keeping American sons alive.